Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Julia Sadusky, and I'm a licensed psychologist in Colorado. I'm so excited to talk with you today about a recent law in Colorado that was established in 2019 that targets conversion therapy bans in minors in our state. I'm eager to get to share with you today how this law applies to Christian therapists and how we as people of faith can really approach and understand the law accurately. So I want to give you a little bit of a sense for our time. What are we going to be talking about in more detail? So I'll start with some opening reflections, just kind of giving you a little bit of context for this law and the lay of the land for Christians in the field of psychology and counseling. Then I'm going to talk with you a little bit about the specific law in Colorado we're going to delve into more today. This law is called the Minor Conversion Therapy Law, or MCTL. We're going to talk through some of the benefits that I see in this law, and then also acknowledge some of the ways this law has presented challenges for Christian therapists in our state. And then as we move through all of that, we're going to talk through also religiously accommodative therapy approaches in the realm of sexual orientation and gender. So what are the things that Christian therapists can offer to their clients under this law that allow us to do effective therapy? I'll wrap up with a time of Q&A where we get to really dive into your questions, and then that'll wrap up our time, okay? So let's start with opening reflections. What are we here to understand today? There is a law in Colorado established in 2019 that targeted a specific type of therapy called conversion therapy. Maybe you've heard of this type of therapy, but it's an umbrella term, we'll say, for a lot of different clinical approaches that make as the goal of therapy changes in sexual orientation or gender identity. So what's sexual orientation? Sexual orientation is a person's persistent and enduring attraction to the same sex, the opposite sex, or both. Gender identity is a person's experience of self as it relates to their embodiment. So these laws in 23 states and in Washington, D.C. are really trying to look at the specific efforts to change orientation or identity through therapeutic intervention. My hope is over the course of our time, you'll have a really good sense of what this law in Colorado is all about. We'll clarify some of the effective strategies for accompanying young people who come to therapy around sexual orientation and gender. Understanding this law is super relevant here in Colorado, especially now. Maybe some of you are aware that the Supreme Court has actually taken up a case in Colorado where a Christian therapist has shared that she really believes this law is a violation of her freedom of speech. So I won't go into the specifics of that lawsuit today, but I think it gives us a good opportunity as Christian clinicians to really look at what does this law have to do with us as Christian clinicians? What does it inform about our approach in therapy? And what do we need to know about it to be effective in our practices? I also want to name that I am a licensed psychologist here in Colorado. I'm aware that some of you who are listening are not licensed psychologists at all. Maybe some of you are licensed social workers or licensed professional counselors, and all of us have different ethics bodies that oversee our work. So when I talk through ethics and legalities, I'm going to be referencing a lot of the psychologist frameworks that we have to offer. So you'll have to kind of apply this to your own group and your own licensing body as we go. So let's lay the context a little bit. Maybe this won't surprise any of you that there are historical tensions between the field of psychology and counseling and religion and spirituality. Does that sound familiar? It has been challenging, I think, for many people of faith to feel represented by psychology and counseling. I've heard from people who come in my office that they're worried about a therapist questioning their faith, kind of explaining away God, explaining away free will, and explaining away spirituality as something that's nothing more than a defense mechanism. So think Freud, right? And on the other side of this, we certainly have many people in psychology and counseling who don't really appreciate religion and spirituality. Maybe people who have pathologized religion as something that ought to be held at arm's length or as a problem or at odds with human mental health. Actually, what we've seen from research is that a much larger portion of psychologists and licensed social workers are non-religious, much more so than the general public. This creates a lot of misunderstandings when people come to therapy who have conventionally religious beliefs. This impacts biases of clinicians a lot of the time, and it makes many Christians in the general population hesitant to go see a mental health provider. Now, at the exact same time, the field of psychology and counseling in the realm of sexual orientation and gender has really framed some of these experiences as positive variants of human sexuality, so kind of non-moral realities for people. That, for many faith traditions, is actually in contrast with where people of faith fall on some of these experiences. So that creates an added tension for many people in the realm of sexuality and gender when they come to therapy. They're really afraid, is my clinician, is my therapist going to appreciate and understand the deeply held convictions I have in the realm of spirituality and faith? So in addition to that, we're also seeing something really exciting and encouraging in our field. We're seeing a growing appreciation for religion as a diversity variable. So if you read American Psychological Association today, they're talking a lot about how religion is an aspect of human diversity, an aspect of human identity to be accounted for in therapy. This is good news because anytime you're integrating religion and spirituality in treatment, we're seeing a lot of evidence in the research that it's actually helping reduce people's depression, anxiety, suicidality, and improving their outcomes in therapy. So simply integrating religion and spirituality is helpful for many people in general. Clients also talk about wanting to talk with their therapist about religion in therapy. At the same time, they wish their therapist would bring it up. Isn't that interesting? However, think about this for a second. What did we say a minute ago? Psychologists and often social workers are much less likely to be religious than their clients. And what we know from research is this: therapists who are personally religious are more likely to be willing to have these conversations, more likely to bring them up, and more likely to show empathy and respect for client autonomy in this conversation. Do you see the challenge and the tension there? That people are wanting to talk about religion and spirituality a lot in therapy. They want their therapist to bring it up. But if many therapists are not representative of these beliefs, they're going to be very unlikely to bring these things forward. This actually creates a really critical place for Christian therapists to be present in these spaces and conversations about sexuality and gender in therapy. The last piece for our opening introduction is this. Thankfully, many of our licensing bodies are also recognizing the need in the realm of sexuality and gender for religiously accommodative approaches. What do I mean by that? It's kind of what I said a minute ago. We're seeing that people of faith are coming to therapy. They want to talk about sexuality with their therapist. They want to be respected in their deeply held convictions. And the field is saying that's important. We want to help form therapists who can do that work effectively. Even in a recent task force document by the APA, the American Psychological Association, they really highlight the fact that we need to, as clinicians, respect diversity in all aspects of our clients' lives, including age, gender, race, ethnicity, culture, and religion. They're also talking about the importance of actually devising interventions to target people in these communities and really be effective with Christian people. So thankfully, the field is finally saying, yes, we want to help people be effective in working with religious populations. That matters when a law comes forward and there are Christians who are saying that they can't effectively work as Christians according to the law. So let's turn now to Colorado's minor conversion therapy law. What is it? And what are some of the tensions that have come up for religious populations in working with people, especially minors, around sexuality and gender? When I look at the ethics standards that I mentioned earlier from American Psychological Association, there's a really interesting comment made about how we navigate new laws that come forward. And I'll just read this to you now. In the process of making decisions regarding their professional behavior, psychologists have to consider the ethics code in addition to applicable laws and psychology board regulations. In applying the ethics code to our work, We have to consider other materials, other guidelines that have been adopted and endorsed by scientific and professional psychologists and organizations. And we have to follow the dictates of our own conscience, as well as consulting with others in the field. So that gives a framework actually for what we're trying to do today. We're trying to look at what does the law have to say, what do licensing bodies have to say, and what are some of the other guidelines provided by the field of psychology and counseling to help us interpret this law in an accurate way. So state regulations, not the most exciting thing to talk about today, is something else we have to comment on here. Professional psychology and counseling all require a license, don't they? We can't just practice psychology because we want to and feel really like we're a good listener. We actually have to get education, clinical hours, a whole host of other things, just like lawyers and medical doctors have to. So state regulations apply to us. And there are already actually a range of laws that exist that govern and tell us a little bit about how we can practice in our field. If you're a practicing clinician, this won't surprise you. There are many restrictions on our speech and our behaviors in therapy. What are some of those things? There are a whole host of laws in state to state on confidentiality, right? What I can and cannot say about my clients. I literally cannot say their names to anybody, even if I really want to, or think I have a good reason for it. We also have limits to confidentiality, things that we're required by law to say at times if there are certain safety measures that we have to take with somebody. We have a duty to warn in some cases if somebody's of imminent harm to somebody else. We have bans, literal bans on sexual behaviors between therapists and clients. All of these things, there have been laws established to bracket us and to protect our clients in times where our speech or our behaviors would do harm. So that gives a little bit of precedent for laws that apply to speech and behavior of clinicians. Now, 3 more pieces to touch on here. The purposes of state laws are this. They determine what qualifies any one of us to be licensed in our state. They help field and manage complaints that come before the licensing body if we do something wrong. And they enforce rules that are supposed to protect the public. So how does that apply to this law? The argument made by the state of Colorado in this specific case is that the law that is established to ban conversion therapy in minors is protecting minors from harmful practices. That's the claim. The claim from the other side would be that these practices are not problematic, and the law itself is imprecise in ways that ban way too much of what therapists ought to be able to do in their practice. So let's dive into the law. What does the minor conversion therapy law actually say about conversion therapy? So I'm going to read this to you now, and if you can hang with me, we're going to get into the weeds of it just to make sure we're really understanding it. So conversion therapy means any practice or treatment by a licensee, registrant, or certificate holder that attempts or purports to change an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity, including efforts to change behaviors or gender expressions, or to eliminate or reduce sexual and romantic attraction or feelings towards individuals of the same sex. Are you hanging with me there? That's a lot of words, and that's just part of the law. Okay, so we'll break it down in just a second. Now, the law actually also says, here's what conversion therapy doesn't include. So here's what you're allowed to do in therapy with minors, and these are some of the things. Conversion therapy does not include a practice or treatment that provides acceptance, support, and understanding for the facilitation of an individual's coping, social support, and identity exploration and development, including sexual orientation neutral interventions, things like trying to prevent or reduce unlawful or unsafe sexual practices, as long as the counseling does not seek to change orientation or gender identity. Now, the law also states that conversion therapy is not the same thing as assisting a person going through a gender transition. So that big picture is what we're talking about today. I want to highlight a few pieces here. The first piece of this law is that the goal of therapy can't be with a minor to change their sexual orientation, so the direction of their romantic and sexual attraction, and it can't be to change their gender identity. So if I have a client who comes to see me who identifies as a heterosexual person, I cannot try to help my client identify as gay. And if a client comes to me and they identify as gay as a teenager, I can't come in and say, my goal for you in therapy is that you identify as heterosexual, and here's my treatment protocol for how to do that. In the realm of gender, very similarly, I can't say to my clients who are gender nonconforming, let's say at 8 years old, let's take a little boy who maybe is really drawn to dresses and imaginative play where he's kind of dancing around and playing with Barbies, that as a therapist, I can't come in and say, hey parents, if you take away the Barbies, hide the dresses, and get him in baseball, he'll be really comfortable with his sex. That wouldn't be permissible under this law. But what is permissible under the law? I kind of already mentioned this. There's terms like acceptance, support, and facilitating identity exploration, right? Now, if you're not a therapist, you might hear some of those things and think, acceptance, support, is that a political framing on this? What does acceptance mean? What does support mean? So if I'm accepting and supporting somebody, does that mean I'm affirming an LGBT identity? And for some Christians, that might be a difficult thing that might get at your beliefs and values in ways that would be challenging for you in therapy. It's worth naming that if you are trained in the field of psychology and counseling, you know acceptance and support are not political terms for us. They're just clinical terms, kind of like unconditional positive regard. A layperson might not know what the heck that means, but we know what that means, right? Now, interestingly, the language of this law actually comes from the American Psychological Association document all the way back in 2009, where a task force was put together to really offer a framework for appropriate therapeutic responses when a person is seeking to navigate questions around sexual orientation in therapy. Listen to what the language of this IPA task force said at that time. The clinical literature indicated that adults perceive a benefit when they're provided with client-centered, multicultural, evidence-based approaches that provide acceptance and support, comprehensive assessment, active coping, social support, identity exploration, and development. So this law was actually framed around our field's framing in 2009 around how to approach this conversation. But thankfully, the 2009 document also defines what these terms mean. I don't know if everybody who's heard about this law has really looked at some of that framework, and so I want to offer it to you now. The field of psychology in APA's document defines acceptance and support as unconditional acceptance of and support for the various aspects of the client, respect for the client's values, beliefs, and needs, and a reduction of internalized sexual stigma. So this rejection of myself by virtue of my sexual experience. That's what acceptance and support means under the law. Comprehensive assessment just means being aware of the complete person, including their mental health concerns that could impact their distress around sexual orientation. What does active coping mean? Many of us know this already, that active coping is just cognitive and emotional strategies that we help our clients use to manage stigma, conflicts that come up, including the development of different ways of thinking about ourselves, our experiences, and resolving areas of dissonance. So dissonance including between our beliefs and values. What does social support mean? Social support, which is a really helpful thing for all of us to manage life on life's terms, helps reduce our isolation, rejection, and it improves our capacity to cope with life on life's terms. So we try to help people connect to therapy, self-help groups, our faith community, other places where we can resource people in our corner who walk through life with us. The last piece here is identity exploration and development. All this means is offering permission and opportunities for a person to look at the options available to them, reduce conflicts that come up for them, and be able to help conceptualize myself and my experiences without the therapist dictating a particular outcome. So what's permitted under the law? It's all of those pieces I just mentioned. And when the law explicitly states identity exploration and development, it actually concedes what research shows, which is that many youth will explore identity through adolescence and take a lot of different pathways when it comes to sexual and gender identity over time. So the law is intentionally broad in allowing for a lot of things that are really helpful for teens today. Being able to have an adult who can walk with them through life, explore possibilities, explore pathways, without the therapist deciding what the outcome's going to be at the start. So I want to say a few things about this idea of a fixed outcome. Remember, I've said that a couple of times already. These types of bans actually are trying to ban any practice that sets a fixed outcome for people, while allowing space for faith-congruent outcomes. What do I mean by that? MCTL does not prescribe an outcome, so it doesn't say that the therapist can only support their client if their client identifies as LGBT at the end of therapy. At the same time, it doesn't require a therapist to share with a client a particular belief system about things like gay marriage, about things like medical transition. It doesn't say you have to speak about those things in a certain way. However, it clarifies that if a minor was to choose to transition in the realm of gender, the therapist supporting the client who's considering and then moving down that path would not be violating the statute in doing so. Now, the law doesn't say that the goal of therapy has to be medical transition, which is really helpful because actually we know from research, most people navigating gender in adolescence don't pursue medical transition at that time. So it would be a strange thing to write into the law. And then if the client was to choose to disidentify as gay or trans, sometimes people come to therapy. I can think of clients of mine who came in and let's say an adolescent female who came in identifying as bisexual and as time went on fell in love with somebody of the opposite sex and said, I just don't use that term anymore because it doesn't quite fit. I'm in a heterosexual relationship. Now I'm still attracted to girls from time to time, but I'm just going to use the term that maps on the relationship I'm in. That would not be banned under this law. And then if a client was even to come in and say, hey, my goal is to be single for the rest of my life. I want to abstain from sexual behavior of any kind. A therapist can help the client learn coping strategies, identify social support, and ways to navigate that in healthy and sustainable ways. All of these pieces allowed under the law. So you may be wondering, what is not allowed under the law, right? It's simply specific narrow goals of therapy, where the therapist says, hey, I can help you change your orientation, or I can help you change your gender identity. And that's the goal of our work. This is consistent with guidelines from APA, ACA, SAMHSA, and WPATH, all of which indicate effective therapy in this area is not meant to have a fixed outcome in any direction. Now, we benefit being reminded this is actually true for a lot of our work in therapy, isn't it? When a family comes to see me and let's say a couple is having really challenging conflicts in their marriage, and at the start of therapy, they say to me, listen, I want you to help me stay married. I can say to them, okay, that's your goal. You want to stay married. I also want to acknowledge there are times where people come to therapy and through therapy, they actually decide to not stay married at some point. So I just want to acknowledge that as a possibility for you. How would that be for you if that was to come to fruition? That's just a part of informed consent, actually. When people come to see me and they say, you know what, I'm not a Christian, I don't want to be a Christian anymore, but I come from a religious background and I want to explore that in therapy. My goal is to never be a Christian again. I might say to them, okay, well, we can talk about your background, we can talk about your identity journey with faith. Now, I have to acknowledge there are people who change their mind of that over the course of therapy. You're just giving that information and education. But that doesn't mean you're holding out the fixed outcome as the therapist. I really need you to be a Christian at the end of therapy. Or I really need you to stay married for me to feel effective. I really need for you to not self-harm at the end of therapy. That's my goal for you. Well, that is a good goal. And also we have to collaborate in goal setting with our clients, and we don't actually get to be the one who gets to determine those goals at the outset. So this brings us to another piece that we really need to press into here. What are the benefits of conversion therapy bans for minors? So in the midst of concerns about these bans for people of faith, what are some of the benefits that we see coming from banning conversion therapy? The first thing I would say is this. I mentioned a little bit ago that identity development for many teens is very fluid. I mentioned that teen who kind of identified one way and then was exploring relationships and really aligned with this person and fell in love and said, I want to use a different word to talk about myself. We didn't do conversion therapy. That person just was exploring identity in developmentally appropriate ways and came naturally to a place where she made that decision for herself. So if that identity process is natural and totally unfolding without intervention, why do I feel like I have to coerce an outcome through intervention at all? And if we were to try to coerce an outcome, we ought to know that the interventions we're using are effective towards the outcome we're claiming. So let's talk about that for a second. The claim of people who have offered conversion therapy is that efforts to change orientation and gender identity work, meaning that that kid who identifies, as gay and comes to therapy to change their orientation over time and over the course of intervention could experience an increase in attraction to the opposite sex. Well, when you look at the overwhelming research in this area, we actually find that those approaches have not been effective in increasing opposite sex attraction on the whole. Now, I'm not discounting that there are people I've met with who have shared with me over the course of therapy, I experienced an increase of attraction to the opposite sex through some of these interventions. Perhaps that's the case sometimes. But on the whole, the majority of people who seek changes in orientation do not experience the change that they hoped. So when people come to me and they're wondering about this, that's some of what I share, which is I don't know an effective treatment intervention that does what you're seeking to accomplish. So conversely, let's talk about some of the other pieces about conversion therapy that are maybe cause for concern for us as Christians. There is significant research and anecdotal evidence of harm through conversion therapy. Now, a lot of this research is done with adults and not minors, because if you know research, you know it's hard to study minors in therapy. But what we know from the research we have are a couple of key pieces I want to share with you now. There are significant mental health consequences documented by efforts to change a person's orientation or identity. This may not be surprising to you if you think as a Christian in terms of principles like unconditional love. People have shared with me that when they went to therapy to try to change their orientation, they had a sense that they would be more holy or more Christ-like if their attraction to the same sex went away. They go through the therapy, they do the protocol, maybe they do it a couple of years in a row, hoping that it will help, and they come out of that experience feeling pretty angry and hopeless. Like, God, you said that you would help me with this. And the therapist said this protocol will work. Well, now it's not working. Now I'm experiencing more shame, more self-loathing, and I'm actually really mad at God. Which brings me to some of the other consequences I've seen. People of faith, especially minors who come to see me after efforts to change orientation, have shared with me that they don't want to talk to God after these interventions because they're so angry that God didn't deliver on the promise they thought had been made by Him. So there are negative impacts on personal relationship with God and on corporate worship. People who share with me that they can't step foot in a church, or if they do, they experience a panic attack because they can't detach some of the interventions done in conversion therapy with this institutional church that they want to be part of. So I'll ask people, how long has it been since you stepped away from faith? And they'll look at me and they'll say, I didn't step away from it. I didn't have a choice to stay because I can't get myself back in the building. That's one of the other pieces I've seen as a negative consequence of conversion therapy. Another piece is barriers to trust and access to future therapy. I've seen teens come to see me and they're so skeptical of me because I'm a Christian. They say, I know that this law exists where you can't try to change me, but you're a Christian. Will you anyway? And I've had people who after a few weeks just can't keep coming back because it just feels too activating to them to be in the room with a Christian because they're reminded of previous therapists who maybe said, no, we're not going to try to change your orientation. We're just going to heal your trauma. And then over time, they found that the therapist was hoping that if the trauma symptoms went away, maybe the same-sex attraction would go away too. So a lot of negative impacts on access to therapy and people delaying going back to therapy because they're hesitant to trust clinicians again. The final piece, and maybe the most important one for you to take away from our time, is this. Many conversion therapy theories frame the cause of same-sex attraction or the cause of gender questioning as a consequence of the parent-child relationship. Have you heard this? The theory of a smothering mother or a distant father, or maybe parents who wanted a child of one sex and got a child of the other sex. Maybe that's what caused this for them. Now, maybe in theory, that's interesting to some of you, and you think, well, I've heard stories where people have made those attributions, and that was helpful for them. Okay, what I would offer is this. What I've witnessed as a clinician when people come out of these approaches is the teenagers are blaming their parents for their experience. They're mad at mom and dad. Mom, why were you so smothering? I wouldn't be gay if you didn't do that. Dad, you were so distant, and now I'm gay. And they don't want to talk to mom and dad. There's a ton of conflict in the home. All of that hurt is coming out sideways in the parent-child relationship. I share that with you because actually when we look at research on the mental health of teenagers who are experiencing same-sex sexuality or gender exploration, one of the key predictors of their well-being over time is the quality of their relationship with their parents. So any intervention that runs the risk of putting these teens at odds with their parents in an environment of hostility or rage is not going to be an effective intervention for them, Christian or not. We want to help improve some of the interventions we're offering, reducing the focus on causal theories that blame parents and alienate teens from their parents. And what I would offer to close this piece of our conversation is this, that there are people who have come to me and said, you know what, I went to a conversion therapy experience and I didn't experience some of the aversive techniques like shock therapy or kind of being taught how to sit or how to talk in a gender-conforming way. So it wasn't bad for me. And I'll ask them what was helpful about it. And they'll say things like, well, I felt like my therapist listened to me. It was the first time I confided in somebody about my sexual orientation or my gender dysphoria. And it was so nice to have somebody, an adult, that I could trust with that. And I would just offer to you that those pieces that are helpful for some people can be provided in any form of therapy in this space. So I don't think any of the benefits that I've heard of about conversion therapy are attributable to conversion therapy interventions. And I think that a lot of the things that we can offer can be offered without those interventions. So the value of conversion therapy bans is this: increasing youth confidence in therapy and willingness to access it, knowing they're going to be protected from interventions that are not effective and in some cases harmful. It protects against interventions that negatively impact people's access to their faith and to their relationship with God. And it buffers against alienation in the parent-child relationship. So the final piece that we're going to cover today is this: what are alternatives to conversion therapy for religious people? Thankfully, we all care about offering competent care to Christians in this space. We all want to figure out, how do we intervene in a way that accounts for people's beliefs and values? And we ought to be concerned if a law was to violate our freedom of speech or our religious liberties as Christians. I would just offer to you that this law in particular is very narrow in its scope, and it's not restricting anything that can offer effective care to our clients who are Christians. So in the field of psychology and counseling, there have really been two dominant approaches to sexual orientation and conflicts between a person's faith and sexuality. You might call one of them a gay affirmative care model, which at some points can actually frame a person's faith as hostile or a problem to be kind of gotten rid of. Like, let's get rid of the faith piece because that's your stumbling block here. Well, for many religious clients, they want to hold on to their faith. They want to bring that with them as they explore sexuality. So gay affirmative care historically has not been the best fit for many conservative Christian clients. On the other hand, sexual orientation change efforts or conversion therapy has been found to be harmful and not effective for people. So what do we offer in this space? I want to just offer a comment on a type of therapy developed by Mark Yarhouse, he's a Christian psychologist who specializes in sexuality and gender and faith. He's done a ton of research in this area with religious populations, and the approach that he came up with was something called sexual identity therapy. What are the goals of this therapy? And they will sound familiar as you heard about the law. The goals are first treating co-occurring mental health concerns. So if a person comes in with depression, anxiety, suicidality, PTSD, we're treating those things and giving priority to helping people cope with life on life's terms. We're not making the focus sexual orientation, we're making the focus the broad health of this person. And then the primary goal of this approach is simply this, congruence, helping a person clarify their beliefs and values and their behaviors and bringing those things into alignment. So I get to kind of navigate how do I live and move in the world as a person of faith with the beliefs and values that I have. It allows for identity exploration, including spiritual identity, adaptive coping, including drawing from faith resources, increased social support, helping connect people to pockets of safety and support in their religious communities to walk this out. And of most important, improving the quality of the parent-child relationship. So that's a little bit of a summary of sexual identity therapy, one way to offer people of faith religiously accommodative care. Another approach that could also be seen as a kind of third way here around gender is actually an approach that I developed with Mark Yarhouse called Gender and Religious Identity Therapy. In short form, we'll call it GRIT. What is the model here? The model is very similar to SIT. When a person is exploring gender, has questions around gender identity, or experiences gender dysphoria, the first thing we're doing in this model is treating co-occurring concerns. We're helping reduce the intensity of depression, anxiety, suicidality when present, improving communication if a minor has challenges and conflict with their family. We're working on all those pieces like we would with any other teen. And then we're also helping them with identity exploration, something very common in adolescence. We're not holding out a fixed outcome of transition or a fixed outcome of alignment with their sex. We're recognizing that they're actively navigating this in real time, and we're along for that journey. We're helping with adaptive coping, exploring their values around this. I can think of people who would say to me, you know what? By virtue of my beliefs and values, I would not adopt a different name or different pronouns. It's just not where I am in my beliefs and values. So I can cope with gender in other ways, but I'm not going to do that. Increasing social support, including support from their faith community, and improving the quality of the parent-child relationship. So these just give you a couple of models that you can use in your practice to be effective with these populations without coercing an outcome which is not permitted by the law. Let's close with some key takeaways before we open up a time for questions. What's the first takeaway? No surprise, there are concerns today about how laws around therapy with sexual and gender minority minors impact religious liberty, client autonomy, and youth mental health. I think we all ought to be concerned about that and be studious about the laws that are being put out and make sure that they're allowing for client autonomy and religious liberty. Religious clients do deserve religiously accommodative approaches that are effective and do not subject them to harm. The benefits of conversion therapy can be provided by other forms of effective therapy, and the drawbacks can be avoided by alternative religiously accommodative approaches. And effective therapy in the realm of orientation and identity always has to account for identity exploration, active coping, social support, and supporting people's personal faith journeys and fostering the parent-child relationship. We're going to go ahead and take a break now, and then we come back together. We're going to open up a time of questions.
So I've heard that under these bans, we're only allowed to let our clients medically transition. that puts us in a really tough spot. Is that true?
That's such a great question. And I think it is a common concern for people. Does this law require me to affirm things that maybe for some religious people they can't in good conscience affirm? And the truth of the matter is this. The law actually makes no demands on us in terms of what we ought to believe about medical transition, and it makes no mention of medical transition at all, except for to say if you're working with somebody and they decide to pursue that and you work with them as they do that, you're not violating the law. The key with the law is this. If a client has a particular gender identity, let's say they align with their sex, you cannot use therapy to try to make them identify as transgender. And conversely, if you have somebody who comes in and they say, I identify as transgender and I have panic attacks, and I want you to treat those, you cannot use therapeutic intervention to try to make them not identify as transgender at the end of therapy. So the good news for us as Christians with this law is it actually protects teenagers from being coerced in any direction here, from being kind of pushed by the therapist, whatever the therapist's beliefs and values are, towards an outcome. Identity development doesn't work like that, actually. Identity development is something that's sustainable when it happens naturally in a community of people who are walking alongside you and letting you kind of explore identity as a teenager without locking you into something. So no, the law does not require you to facilitate medical transition or to only support clients who identify as LGBT.
So as a therapist, when I have a family come with a teen that has questions around sexuality or faith and trying to understand who they are, but wants some conversion therapy kind of element, how would you help guide me in a way to help them hold on to their faith while still doing what they're asking me to do?
Right. Yes, I have had this happen, and it sounds like you have as well. So sometimes people do, they come to us and they say, hey, I'm really looking for you to help me change my orientation or gender. I've had parents of a teenager say to me, hey, I know there's a law that bans this, but I've also heard that it helps. So can you help us with that? And the first thing I would say about this is usually you get that question in an intake. And they don't trust you yet. They don't trust me yet. They don't have a reason to trust me yet. And I remind all of my clients that you don't have a reason to trust me by virtue of me being a therapist. In fact, you might have every reason not to trust me by virtue of me being a therapist. So we start there. How do I build trust with somebody in that intake? I've had friends who are secular clinicians, not people of faith, who right out the gate come on really harshly with these individuals and families, are very judgmental of the parents, like, that's so shaming and rejecting of your child. How dare you? Don't you know that this is so harmful for people? Well, what happens in those cases? The parents leave, they don't come back, and they go to somebody else, or they don't go to therapy at all. So I want to temper with these families this kind of harsh, reactive, how dare you ask that question? Why do Christian parents ask these questions? Most of them have been taught that there are effective strategies through conversion therapy to change orientation and identity. And they'll say to me, my child will have a harder life if they're navigating this. They're gender nonconforming in ways that I know make them likely to get bullied. So if there's ways to kind of change this, can't we just do it? Or I've always dreamed of my child's wedding day. And how will that play out if they identify as gay long term? So as a clinician, I'm reflecting back the wishes and longings of the parents. Like what I hear you asking for is something that makes your child's life easier. You don't want them to suffer long term. And I love to hear that you care about your child's mental health and suffering. You don't want them to suffer unintentionally. That's really important. Many parents, if I ask them, what are you afraid of if they don't change their orientation or if they don't change their gender? The parents will say things like, I'm afraid they'll lose their faith. I've never met somebody who's a Christian who's gay or who's Christian and has gender dysphoria. So my sense is that nobody cares about faith who's navigating these questions. So I validate that with the parents. Of course, you're afraid of your child losing their faith. And then I share with them a little bit about the approach I offer. I say, listen, I don't have a protocol to do what you're asking me to do that works. I've never been trained or taught in something, and I've looked at the research in that. I'm happy to discuss the research in that if you have questions about it. But I just haven't seen from research a compelling evidence that that works. So let me tell you what I offer. What I offer is an identity-focused, client-centered approach that takes seriously your teenager's faith, takes seriously your beliefs and values, and helps your teen explore identity without coercing an outcome. Parents often want to know, what are the outcomes for these young people? And I will list out the different pathways people take, that there are people who are so rooted in their faith at the end of therapy. There are people who walk away from their faith at the end of therapy. And there's a lot of other possibilities. But what I can guarantee over the course of my work with somebody is if they have depression, anxiety, suicidality, and other mental health concerns, we are going to bring evidence-based treatment to effectively improve their mental health. When I say that to Christian parents, I've never had one say, "Don't sign me up for that." They just have been told that the only interventions that help their children are conversion therapy ones.
As a therapist, I really love my clients who identify as LGBTQ. But I find that fear and anxiety rises in me as I'm working with them because I don't want to overstep or impose my faith and values in a way that's not right or in their best interest or could do harm. How do you cope with this?
That is so common. I think that's a challenge for many Christians who want to do right by their clients, and the anxiety comes up around that. This is one of the things I really appreciate about the ban on conversion therapy in minors, actually, is I think that anxiety is a good thing. It keeps me diligent. It keeps me mindful around such sacred spaces for people to not step in and coerce in a way that I think we're all at risk for because we're human beings. And so I just want to honor, that love you have for your clients and care that you want to do right by them. And then I think as far as the anxiety goes, this is part of doing these types of trainings and this type of formation, is being clear about what is harmful and being clear and confident about what actually helps. And then as you press into the things that help and you're holding in mind, okay, these are the things I'm not doing, you actually can start to feel greater freedom over time as you do the work you would do with anybody else. I know how to help people with distress tolerance. I know how to help people with emotional regulation. And sometimes in our circles, people with LGBT experiences are framed as a different group of people who need something different. And so I think I want to embolden us as Christian clinicians to remember that we're working with people who benefit from evidence-based interventions that we already know. So if you do those things, you're going to help people. And if you don't do the things that don't have evidence, you're not going to hurt people.